You know, times are tough right now, so when you have a limited budget, you take what you can get. That brings us to this example of what can only be explained as a very cheap piece of equipment. But it still has a purpose, and as long as we can get it running again, it'll still be useful as well. But the bigger question is whether or not the cost to fix such a cheap machine is even worth doing. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at this cheap Homelite trimmer, and the problem is that I just picked it up and I don't even know if it works. Now by the looks of it though, it hasn't been used in a really long time. And if you know anything about two-stroke trimmers, if you leave them alone, there's a good chance they're going to leave you stranded. Now I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, but yours might be a little different from this one, so it might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now of course, every keyboard mechanic will tell you that if you would have just bought a high-end trimmer, they're not going to leave you stranded like this one did. So all I have to say to that is, if you neglect them like this one was, there's always a chance that it will, no matter how much it costs. And just because you paid 3 times more doesn't mean it's immune to problems, especially the ones related to neglect. And speaking about neglect, before I get too far into this project, I'm going to wash off about a couple of years worth of dirt and oil. After that, we'll get down to trying to start this trimmer and see if we need to do anything at all. Now, if you didn't know this, but leaving a two-stroke trimmer alone without at least some preparation could lead to some headaches, especially with the fuel system. Of course, I'm mainly going to talk about the carb, but there's more to it than just the carb when talking about the entire fuel system. That means we'll have to take a look not only at the carb, but also the fuel lines, the fuel tank, and even the fuel filter for any issues related to neglect. Now the first thing that I see is that there's a dark brown buildup of probably old gasoline in the fuel tank. So to help break this up, I'm going to spray some of the degreaser into the tank and let it sit while we continue to clean it. Now according to the owner's manual for this particular trimmer, if you were going to store it for more than a couple of months, it wants you to empty the fuel tank and run the engine until it stops. But because there's a dark residue in the fuel tank, it means this step was probably not done, and the fuel that was left in there could have possibly damaged parts of the fuel system. So it's been a couple of minutes since we put that degreaser in the fuel tank, which means it's now time to pour it out. And what comes out of it is not very promising. This is what's left of the fuel and oil from the last time it had anything in there. What that means is that there's a good chance that this residue might also be in the carb as well, and we'll need to take it apart and clean it too. Now, I'm going to spray some water into the fuel tank to flush out anything else that might be left in there, and yet again, what comes out is still very disturbing. Now, as you can see, there are chunks of white stuff that came out of the fuel tank. Now, these white bits are not supposed to be in there, and what that tells me is whatever was in the fuel tank was not completely gasoline and oil, but quite possibly something else, and this is what's left of it. So it's been at least an hour or so since I dumped out the water, which means the tank should be dry, and we can put some fuel into it and then try starting the engine. However, when I tried to purge the air from the system and replace it with fuel from the tank, the bulb did not fill with any fuel. That means the likelihood that the engine is going to start is basically zero, and that we have an issue with some part of the fuel system. So the big question now is which part is going to have the problem. Now most of the time that part's going to be the carb, however that's not always a guarantee. The one thing you have to remember is the fuel system is not just the carb, but also the fuel lines, the tank, and even the gas cap, which most seem to forget. Now, after taking off the pumping side of the carb, I want to make sure that the inlet screen is not blocked with debris, which would be one reason why the bulb is not filling with fuel, but as you can see, it's not, and we'll need to look elsewhere for an issue. Now, another possible reason for the bulb not filling with any fuel would be bad check valve flaps, but after looking at them, they're not warped in any way, so we'll have to look at the metering diaphragm for any issues. Now the diaphragm is under this metal plate, and after getting to it, what we find is pretty typical. Now because of the fuel that was left in the system, the diaphragm is now very petrified, and it's not able to make contact with the rocker arm that's underneath it. Now this arm works a needle to help regulate fuel flow through the carb, so it makes sense that this might be the reason why the purge bulb is not able to get any fuel into it. That means we'll have to replace the diaphragm with a new one and also take it apart so it can be cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner. Now I do want to try and do a thorough cleaning, so I'll have to use a special tool to take out the fuel adjustment screws. But before I do that, I need to turn them clockwise and count how many turns it takes for them to stop first. This will allow me to put the screws back in the way I found them, which should make tuning the carb a bit easier later on. Now if for some reason you happen to forget to do this step, the only thing I would do would be to turn the screws 2 full turns out. However, there's no guarantee that will make tuning any easier. After that, I'm going to carefully take the needle and rocker arm out of the carb and put the larger parts into the bath for at least 2 rounds of cleaning. I'm going to do 2 rounds because after the first round, I'm going to rotate the parts around. Now, doing it this way should give it a greater chance of getting most of the carb cleaned, at least in theory. Now, while the ultrasonic is cleaning the carb, I'm going to take a look at the fuel lines, and what I'm seeing is pretty interesting. The reason I say that is because the lines themselves are in great condition, and by the looks of it, it seems like I shouldn't have any issues reusing them. Now, unfortunately, this statement will come back to haunt me in the worst way, as you're going to see here in just a bit. So the parts are done in the ultrasonic, but here's the best part. I still have to clean the parts by hand by using carb cleaner and compressed air. I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm certainly beginning to second guess my choice of even buying this expensive machine. And after that extra bit of cleaning, we can now start to put the carb back together. So if you've never done this type of work before, all I can say is be very careful, because if you do this part wrong, the carb isn't going to work and you're just going to end up replacing the carb in the end anyway. So my advice to those who do not want to deal with this possible headache is to just buy a new carb and skip the hard part. No one's going to tell you you're less of a person because you're aware of what your capabilities are and dealt with it the best possible way. And even though I've been told that replacing a carb instead of servicing it is like replacing an engine in a vehicle instead of changing the oil, I still say do what you want and don't listen to what the others say. So these diaphragms can be bought individually, and if you need one of them, there should be a link to them in the description of this video. Now, I will say that each one is about $5. However, if you buy more than a couple in a multi-kit, each one could be as little as $1 each. Now, the old diaphragm was not completely petrified and still has some life left in it. So I'm not going to throw it away, and instead I'm going to put it into a rejuvenation bath so that I can use it later on if I need to. Now, once the carb is finally back together, I'm going to install it back onto the engine, and this is when things go off the rails, so to speak. The reason I say that is because after connecting the fuel lines and adding some fuel to the tank, we should be able to now purge the system and watch the new bulb fill up with fuel. But things don't always go according to plan, as you're going to see here in a bit. So I'm going to leave the air filter cover off, and the reason why is because it's going to be blocking your view of the adjustments I have to make on the screws. And besides that, there is no air filter. Instead, it only relies on a screen to filter the air. However, after pressing the bulb, I soon realized we still have a purging issue, as no fuel is making it into the carb. Now, at this point, the only thing that could be keeping fuel from making it to the carb would be a clogged fuel filter, and after getting it out of the tank, it certainly looks a bit off. So if I'm going to replace the fuel filter, I might as well replace the fuel lines as well, just in case they're damaged on the inside and could be closed up, preventing fuel from moving through them. Now, the worst part is that I probably should have done this anyway, since I didn't have any information saying they were good in the first place. Now, the fuel lines I'm using along with the filter was stuff I already had on hand from other projects. But any fuel line kit that you find online should do just fine as well. However, having bought them in bulk means the parts I'm using are very cheap in comparison to those kits, so if possible, try buying in bulk to save a couple of bucks. Now, once the new fuel lines have been installed and the fuel is put back into the tank, hopefully this time when we press on the bulb, it'll fill up. Otherwise, we'll have to move on to plan B. And if you weren't sure what plan B was, it's of course to just buy a new carb, which I have no issues doing. However, this time after pressing the bulb, it's now filling with fuel, which means we can now try and start the engine. So luckily it did start and run, however it eventually stalled once the engine got a bit warmer. What that's telling me is that the carb was not able to supply enough fuel to the engine, and to deal with that, I'm going to turn the L screw counterclockwise a quarter turn and then start it again and see what happens. So after making a few adjustments to the L screw and keeping the engine from stalling and then lowering the idle speed to keep the trimmer head from constantly spinning, we then made our adjustments to the H screw. Now in the end, we basically turned out the L screw by about 1/4 of a turn and the H screw by about 3/4 of a turn. However, these settings will need to be checked again, and we'll do that by doing multiple cold starts. And only after making sure that we don't need to make constant changes to the screws will I be happy with how it's tuned. Now, if for some reason we need to keep tuning the carb every single time you use it and it has a hard time starting, you might have to consider getting a new carb because it seems like the old carb has an issue that a good servicing simply won't fix. So in the end, it took about an hour or so of time to fix this trimmer, and at least for me, less than $5 to get it working again. So in my book, that's a much better deal than buying another cheap trimmer. Of course, if you had a much more expensive trimmer, fixing it would be a much better deal, but I'll take a $5 repair any day over having to pay for a brand new trimmer, whether battery or gasoline. So my question is, do you think it was worth fixing this cheap trimmer, or was $5 still too much to pay to get it working again? I like to buy new stuff too, just like any other person, but only if I have to. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.